Hey, everybody, and welcome back to our series on the real history of Constantinople. We've had some great guest speakers this entire week, from Professor Judith Heron to Alekos Kiru, George Demakopoulos, and today we're especially honored to have featured Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou, a regular in our HALC programming. And many of you who listen to our podcast will have caught her, the interviews that we've done with Dr. Prodromou as well. Dr. Prodromou, welcome to our series.
Thank you, Thanos. It's great to be back with you.
So before I bring in Dr. Prodromou into our screen, I would like to give a little brief background on her bio and a little bit about the program. So today we're going to be talking about Constantinople still falling and cultural heritage and propaganda in modern Turkey. Now, Dr. Prodromou is an internationally recognized leader on issues of religion and human rights, and a previous vice chair and commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. She's a faculty member at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where she directs the initiative on religion, law, and diplomacy. She's also co-chair of the Working Group on Christians and Religious Freedom in the Middle East, which began at the Center for American Progress and has continued at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Elizabeth, let's get started. So when we talk about Constantinople still falling, how does cultural heritage help us understand the idea of the siege that's continuing and the fall that's continuing more than 500 years since 1453?
Let me offer a couple of observations, but also first begin by, again, thanking you and HALC for this series on the real Constantinople. I think it's, an incredible series of conversations that speaks to the way and the reality of Constantinople, opposed to some of the misinformation and disinformation, and as I write in my title here, the political propaganda that has shaped the current view of Constantinople. So thank you. And in answer to your question, why are we talking about the city still falling, and where does cultural heritage fit? Let me say, three things. First of all, as a general observation, I think it's important for us to recognize that in this period of the COVID-19 pandemic, Turkey has been unwavering in its cultural and religious heritage policy over the last 3 months. And so while the world has really focused on the coronavirus pandemic, and that's really thrown into sharp relief the need to focus on, I think, the universality of humanity, Turkey has focused on a cultural heritage policy that I would argue is part of the ongoing fall of the city. And we'll talk a little bit more about the details of that. Mm-hmm. But I also think it's important for us to recognize that, although the fall is a historic event that, occurred beginning actually these days, April 6th, the siege began of the Queen of Cities and culminated on Black Tuesday on May 29th, 1453. That siege, that historic event of the siege, the cultural and religious heritage practices of the Ottoman Empire continued for another 4 centuries. And then since the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, those same policies contribute to what I would argue is an effort to erase the memory as well as the living presence of the ecumenical patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Christianity in Turkey. And so those policies and practices, because they're with us to the very moment, mean that the fall is continuing. And then finally, one other observation for us to think about, why it's important to think about religious and cultural heritage right now. Western Christians just had celebrated Easter last Sunday. Jews are completing their Passover today, and Eastern Christians we're observing Holy Thursday today in anticipation of the Pascha celebration on Sunday. And then next month, Muslims will begin a month-long observation of Ramadan. So this is a period of religious observance, and religious observance means the ability to worship freely, to engage in one's cultural and religious practices freely. And yet, if we look at the details of Constantinople still falling, we see that the policies of the Turkish state are informed by a philosophy that's oppositional to universal human rights and people being able to practice and worship, remember, and sustain themselves. So I think this is a kind of conjunctural moment that's useful for us to be thinking about this issue when it comes to Constantinople and Turkey's political propaganda with cultural and religious heritage.
So when you mention cultural heritage, can you give us some examples of what you're talking about? I know, and how does the understanding of what is happening, affect the patriarchate in Constantinople today?
Sure. So cultural heritage, I think, is a term that's been mainstreamed, more and more in the press and policy discussions over the last 25 years in the post-Cold War period. But it's also a very broad concept. So when we talk about cultural heritage and religious heritage being both a part of but separate from cultural heritage, we're usually thinking about the whole range of ways of living that are developed by communities whose identity may be organized according to their ethnicity, their language, their religion. So cultural heritage is these ways of living that are transmitted across generations through preserving practices, customs, places, sites, objects, artistic expressions, and importantly, all the values and worldview that's associated with that heritage. And the other thing I think that's important for us in thinking about the patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Christians in Turkey when it comes to cultural heritage is to realize that cultural heritage is both tangible and intangible. So when we think about, prayer or we think about customs, these may be intangible things, but then there are the tangible elements of cultural heritage. So let me give some concrete examples. We can think about cultural and religious heritage of the ecumenical patriarchate and Greek Orthodox in Turkey in the following terms: churches, monasteries, chapels, cemeteries, libraries, monuments, museums, schools, artifacts, so sacred and cultural sites and objects that allow the patriarchate in the community to manifest itself, to transmit itself, sustain itself, and transmit its memory and its traditions over time. And also, and this is very crucial, to allow others who may not be part of that community to see it visibly, and also to remember that the community once existed. And
So what is Turkey's policy then vis-a-vis the cultural heritage of the Orthodox Christians that remain in Turkey? And how does it compare to its efforts to preserve cultural heritage that belongs to the Muslim majority of the country, or the Ottoman past?
Okay, all right. So I would summarize Turkey's policy on cultural heritage broadly. So this applies to Greek Orthodox Christians. It applies to Syriac Christians, Orthodox Christians. It applies to Armenian Apostolic Christians, and more generally, but in particular, these three organic indigenous Christian communities. In the East, what was the Eastern Roman Empire. I would say that we can use the following words: destroy, erase, expropriate, appropriate, desecrate, commercialize. These are the terms that sum up what has been a policy that has been designed to erase both the living community and make it impossible for that community to survive, but also, and this is crucial again, to erase the memory of the community, so that if the tragic moment comes where there aren't living communities, the memory of those communities is eradicated by virtue of destroying or appropriating their cultural and religious heritage. And we've seen this consistently, and this is again, I think, a point for us to recognize. We tend to think of, because of our own lived experience and what we read, we tend to think of these policies as associated with the Islamist Erdogan regime. But it's important to recognize that the self-styled secularist Kemalist regime practiced the same policies, perhaps with a less active religious valence. I would say a kind of passive religious valence, but the Erdogan regime has pursued the same policy. So there's been continuity for almost a full century in the history of the Republic of Turkey in terms of the state's religious policy, religious and cultural heritage policy.
Could you go a little bit into the details of what it was like during the Kemalist governments, and then compare it and contrast it with with Erdogan? Because obviously, like you said, we hear a lot about Erdogan's neo-Ottomanism, about Erdogan's and the AKP's Islamist tendencies, and they contrast it with the secular Kemalists. Can you give us some more examples of what that continuity looked like over the last 100 years?
Sure, sure. And I want to just add one footnote too. One of the things about the kind of cultural heritage policy that I described, with these various features of it: destroy, erase, appropriate, expropriate, commercialize, is that oftentimes this policy occurs through nonviolent means, through the use of legislation that accomplishes the goals that I mentioned. And because there may not be violence associated with it, there's a kind of pernicious quality to that policy because it doesn't bring the attention of, international human rights experts. It doesn't bring the attention of the diplomatic attention of other countries. It may happen without the awareness of cultural heritage experts, of artistic experts. So there is a pernicious quality to that. And now I'll go then to the Kemalist, the Kemalist approach. For the most part, the Kemalist governments use this cultural heritage policy through converting religious sites. So, and as I mentioned, the whole host of them, chapels, monasteries, churches, Hagia Sophia, the cathedral, the Great Byzantine Cathedral. They converted those sites into secular spaces, so they were converted into museums. And in that regard, they were then represented to the Turkish public and to the world as museum heritage sites of the Turkish state. So the words, for example, Christian, Orthodox, Rum, Eastern Roman, will be missing from, if you were to do a tour in some of those sites, you would see those words missing. And instead, you would think you're visiting these interesting museums with artifacts, iconography, frescoes, etc., that happen to be part of Turkey's cultural heritage because the signifiers that explain that those were part of a previous religious tradition have been removed. So that's one of the ways that the Kemalist government proceeded and converting many of the churches and religious sites into museums. However, they left some of them as active mosques, but it was generally the secular museum approach. Other things that they did, they converted those sites into, for example, libraries. They converted into concert halls or into concert halls. So again, all of the books would be destroyed, and then the physical space would be used for a beautiful concert, playing, Bach's symphony, for example. So people would gather. You gather in that space. You think, oh, what a beautiful space. This is part of Turkey's architectural heritage, because all, again, of the religious signifiers have been removed. They've been destroyed and erased. And that was the Kemalist approach. The Erdogan approach, a footnote to that. Oftentimes, though, the Kemalist approach would say that, these were once Ottoman mosques, and the mosques are now turned into secular sites. So there was that, active continuity between, Ottoman religiosity, Ottoman religious identity, Islamic religious identity, and Kemalist secular Turkish identity. The Erdogan regime has taken a completely activist approach to remining the Ottoman Muslim identity, and places that were museums are now being reconverted into mosques, and we can talk about that. So that's the distinction, but what you see in both cases is a kind of historic continuity, either cultural and or religious, that completely obliterates and eliminates any of the specific signifiers that would let people know these were once Greek Orthodox locations and sites. And they've also changed the location, the toponyms, the local names. So the mosques, here's an example. What was once the Hagia Theodosia Church had been renamed the Gül Cami, the Rose Mosque. And so people only know those as their mosque names, their Islamic names. They don't know that those were once churches. So this is an example of the difference, but also the continuity towards the same objective, which is destroy, eliminate, erase, repurpose, appropriate.
And recently, I know we've seen it on Twitter and we've seen it in news reports. Obviously, Hagia Sophia as a headliner, where you hear Erdogan continuously say, we want to turn it into a mosque. We're going to turn it into a mosque. He's held prayers in there, and HALC has been active on that front to make sure that we pressure UNESCO to maintain it as a World Heritage Site. Can you give us some more concrete examples of other locations that Erdogan and his government, the AKP government, is working to convert museums back into mosques? I know there was some talk about the monastery Hora in Istanbul, which is home to some of the amazing mosaics from the Byzantine Empire.
Sure. So there's been a very, again, consistent policy of the Erdogan regime to repurpose what were museums back into mosques. Okay, and I think one of the interesting features of that, sad but interesting features of that, has been the focus on churches that were called Hagia Sophia. So an example would be the conversion in 2012 of the Hagia Sophia Church in Iznik, which was Nicaea, which was the site of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and that museum converted under the Kemalist regime from a mosque under the Ottomans. So you see church in Byzantium, mosque in Ottoman Empire, museum in Kemalist Turkey, and now in 2012, conversion into an active mosque in Iznik by the Erdogan government. The focus on Hagia Sophia, the cathedral in Istanbul, I'll come to that in a moment. But another, again, landmark event would be, as you mentioned, in November of last year of 2019, Turkey's top administrative court ruled that the Hora Church, or the Hora Monastery, it was known as the Church of Christ in the Hora Monastery. It was renamed in the Ottoman period as the Kadiye Jami, Kadiye Mosque. The top administrative court in Turkey ruled that the museum could no longer be used as a museum. Why? Because it violated Ottoman law. And so the museum would now have to be reconverted to what it was. And this is, again, the language is important because it's politically propagandizing Turkey's own populace into its original use, which was a mosque. Now, of course, its original use wasn't a mosque. This was a church. But this kind of legal and mediatized approach in cultural heritage sends a political propaganda message, a socialization message to the Turkish public and to the outside world. And as you mentioned, that Hora Monastery, it's one of the most visited sites in Istanbul, and it's visited because it's the place where the church was dedicated by Theodoros Metochitis to the Byzantine emperor in the 14th century, and it's the site of some of the most glorious iconography / frescoes, and they are renowned for being painted and written, as we say about iconography, the writing of icons, in the Paleologan Renaissance style. So the colors and also the physical formation of those represented in the icons are associated with a very important artistic style. And what's also interesting about the Hora Church, Fano, is that it's being restored and prepared and now will be unveiled as a mosque in preparation for the upcoming International Congress of Byzantine Studies. So you have, a global professional academic association that's going to meet in Istanbul, and they're experts on Byzantium, and they're going to come to this Byzantine, Orthodox site that is now going to be an active mosque. So again, it's a kind of propagandistic effort to claim what was Byzantium for Turkey's modern, now neo-Islamic, neo-Ottoman heritage. I have a couple of other examples that, again, I think are useful for us to think about the scope and the range of this policy, if it's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The other one, again, this falls under the radar because nonviolent. The extraordinary Cappadocian monastic cells, which are carved into the side of mountains and caves. Those, the sites of, the Cappadocian fathers and monastic tradition. Those cells have been repurposed by the Turkish Ministry of Tourism as what do they call them? Cave cells. Turkey's heritage of cave hotels. So they've desecrated sacred sites by turning them into hotels, by commercializing the sacred, by saying that this is Turkey's history. And they offer these like hot air balloons. If you were to Google hot air balloon tours in Turkey, you would get all these, extraordinary reviews on TripAdvisor, etc., about some of the most extraordinary hotels and adventures I've ever had. These are Byzantine Christian, Orthodox sites that belong to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And the memory of those as Orthodox Christian sites is being erased, and it's being grotesquely commercialized and propagandized globally as part of Turkey's national tourism. So Turkey's literally generating revenues off of the desecration and eradication of the memory of those Byzantine Christian sites. And that's something that doesn't make its way so much into the media. And I wanted to mention it because the commercialization piece, involves then the desecration of religious and cultural heritage in so many ways, and there's a kind of vulgar dimension to that, but it's nonviolent. So it flies under the radar. And then, of course, you mentioned the creeping Islamization of the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and that's moved incrementally under the Erdogan regime. The the church was converted into a mosque with the fall, and then it was converted into a museum. I think it was 1936. I haven't had enough caffeine, so if my date's off, I apologize. But 1936, I think, by the Kemalist regime. And now the Erdogan government has first allowed prayers in the outside, first in the streets around Hagia Sophia several years ago, then in the outside yard of Hagia Sophia before you enter into the physical structure itself. And then 2 years ago, they appointed through the Diyanet, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, they appointed an official imam for Hagia Sophia. And now, and the Turkish government, the Erdogan government, Erdogan himself, and members of his cabinet have made numerous public statements about that as a Turkish historical heritage site and the need to convert it to a mosque. And so 2 weeks ago, for the first time, there were trial calls to prayer, recorded calls to prayer inside Hagia Sophia, and many say that that's in preparation now for the full-fledged conversion of Hagia Sophia into an active mosque. So you mentioned this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Hagia Sophia is considered heritage to the world, to all of humanity. And Turkey, through its policy, will make it Turkish heritage and, a specifically Islamic heritage site. Erasing again. They've erased the living presence. That should be the headquarters of the the Church of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. They've made that impossible, and now they're going to move more steadily towards erasure and memoricide. So
it would be like the Italian government preventing the Pope from using St. Peter's Basilica.
Correct. Exactly.
And I want to thank you again for touching on that commercialization aspect. As we've been talking, we've been getting questions. So one of the questions that we did get was specifically on that. I'm going to pull it on the screen so that people can see it too, from Joanna, who had asked to elaborate or explain what how this commercialization worked. So I want to thank you on that. Can
I jump in with one thing on the commercialization piece too? And forgive me for interrupting via Skype, or Facebook. But other examples where the Turkish state and Turkish authorities have commercialized Orthodox Christian sites. all over Turkish-occupied Cyprus. For example, the Church of Ayasofya in Turkish-occupied Cyprus was converted into a hotel and casino complex. These are grotesque, policies that are designed not only to erase but also to humiliate. Okay, so there's that sense of power, imbalance, to humiliate, and then also to generate income from a sacred site. And that's why I used at the beginning the term desecrate, because these are sacred sites and they are, further desecrated by their commercialization, which then perpetuates the capacity of those authorities to oppress, in the case of the occupied North, those who are there, and in the case of Turkey, the Greek Orthodox community and the Patriarchate.
Could we talk? There was another question that came in, and I think it's a good point to shift the conversation a little bit. But can you talk about the erasing the physical presence a little bit more? And when I mean that, the actual people that are in Turkey that are the Orthodox Christians, because as many might not be aware, but in the 1920s with the Treaty of Lausanne, there was a protected minority of Greek Orthodox Christians that were to remain in the city of Constantinople. And today, obviously, those numbers have dwindled down to maybe a couple of thousand, and mostly elderly. Can you talk about that process?
Sure. And I think cultural religious heritage policy figures into that. The decline of the living community and the living presence of the Patriarchate in Turkey has occurred through a combined use of violent and nonviolent mechanisms. So, regular the pogroms, for example, the most notorious being the 1955 September pogrom against the Greek Orthodox community and the so-called Septembriana events. Targeted pogroms, the expulsion of Greek Orthodox and Greeks who had either had Turkish citizenship or who lived in Turkey for years in certain events, 1963, 1967, again in 1974. And note that these kinds of, violent and legal predations on the community oftentimes were mapped on to key events, bilateral events in the Greek-Turkish relationship, 1955, for example, or regarding the Cyprus situation, so 1963, 67, and 74. So there have been legal mechanisms used, violent mechanisms used. Those have made it impossible, literally impossible, for the community to survive and sustain itself, but also massive expropriation of private and communal property under a legal regime that has been designed to eliminate the community. So the ability to sell or inherit property intergenerationally. And again, note that cultural heritage linkage there, the intergenerational continuity and sustainability of a community. The expropriation of libraries and cultural sites, using, again, legal means. For example, as the numbers of the community dwindle and requirements about representation on the board of director, for example, of directors of a cultural center, as the numbers don't meet the threshold, the Turkish authorities come in and say, "Oh, you don't have 20 people on your board." Well, you don't have 20 people because there aren't enough people left, right? So they say this is a violation of the law and the state expropriates the property. And I think that's important for us to recognize, again, these combination of violent and non-violent persecution and nonviolent discrimination. And then finally, the chronic interference in the ability of the church to perpetuate itself in terms of its hierarchy, in terms of studying the closing of HALC in 1971, the artificial and completely illegal imposition of the requirement that members of the synod and the patriarch himself must be Turkish citizens. There's nothing in the Turkish constitution that requires this, and indeed Lausanne itself would prevent this. But Turkey has propagandized this message that you must be a Turkish citizen in order to be a synod member of patriarchate. And as the numbers decline, who's left then to fill those slots? So these are some of the mechanisms. So they're multifaceted, but they all have the strategic objective. And that's why I say the city's still falling. It's falling for the Turkish state until all Orthodox Christians are gone, until the patriarchate can no longer function, and so that the cultural and religious heritage that remembers that those people existed will also be gone.
So we've got a stream of questions that have come in. And I would like to bring them in so we can incorporate them in our conversation.
Sure.
I'll start off with a question that relates to the Hora Monastery that we had discussed briefly. And it's from Peter Corbakis. And he asks, is there any word that they will plaster and destroy the icons in the Hora Monastery that you've heard of?
What happened in Ottoman times and then in early Kemalist times is that most of those frescoes were covered over, they were not destroyed, unlike in Hagia Sophia and the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, where they were largely destroyed. In the Hora Monastery, they were covered over, with a thin coating of paint. Those have been, interestingly enough, I would say relatively painstakingly restored under the Erdogan government. Somewhat in the late Kemalist period, but under the Erdogan government, precisely so that they can repackage and represent those as Turkish cultural heritage. I visited I think my last visit to the Hora Church was in 2019. I think it was, I'm trying to recall, I think it was January or March, I can't remember, of 2019. And they were still, the center of the church was roped off because they were going to begin to restore the floor, the mosaics on the floor, but the frescoes on the walls had been restored, and they were that restoration has been in preparation for that, International Congress of Byzantine Studies, and that's occurring in 2021. So I believe that based on empirical evidence, they won't destroy, they're repurposing, repackaging, and they will commercialize and represent this as Turkey's heritage, and most specifically now with the Erdogan regime as Ottoman heritage. So, because it will, after all, be a functioning mosque by the time that Congress meets.
So we've discussed HALC's efforts a little bit to pressure UNESCO on UNESCO World Heritage sites such as Hagia Sophia, and this next question, I think it built off of the commercialization topic that we covered. And Joanna asks, why aren't the cells, for example, the Cappadocian cells, or why aren't more sites in Turkey listed as UNESCO World Heritage sites?
For a site to be listed as a World Heritage site, the state has to make that application for the site to be listed as such. So clearly there's an assessment, a calculation on the part of Turkey that it's not in their interest, at least not now, for those to be evaluated and then ultimately designated as a World Heritage site. But that may come in the future. But what we do know is that there has been a very active and quite successful, unfortunately, effort to commercialize those, Cappadocian hotels. They call them the cave hotels. And so it may indeed come. But I think that the paradox of repressive regimes is that, because states need to make the application for designation by UNESCO, repressive regimes, see that not in their interest. They would rather destroy or repackage, cultural and religious heritage to serve their own interests. And we see this all over the Middle East, but in other parts of the world too. In Afghanistan and in Africa, it might, be interesting for those listening to know that one of the most important recent legal, rulings in the International Criminal Court concerned cultural heritage in Mali and the designation of the destruction of cultural heritage as a war crime. Now, one could argue, well, the International Criminal Court doesn't have any teeth and any compliance mechanisms, but nonetheless, the symbolic and legal recognition of that destruction as a war crime provides a new kind of platform for exposing countries like Turkey that perpetrate those same violations and crimes.
This next question is from Dean Alanistiotis. He was actually the first person to drop a question, but we've been building up the conversation in a way where I think now it's a great time to incorporate it. We touched a little bit about how Turkey is repressive in terms of its dealings with the patriarchate and how it's expropriated its legal rights. And I think recently there was a story that I know HALC had worked on to get it quashed, where they were trying to link the patriarch to the failed coup and to Gulen. And ultimately, backtracing this piece that had come out ended up getting lost somewhere, and the idea may be that it's from Russia. Can you expand on the role that the Russian state or the Russian Orthodox Church is playing in continuing the fall of the city?
Sure, and I think this is it's an important question, but it's also a sad reality because let me just give a slight narration of what happened and then the role of the Moscow Patriarchate in this. I think so. In 2016, after the failed coup attempt in July against the Erdogan government, late August, early September, in Russian language blog sites, there appeared articles, including 2 letters, which were ultimately, exposed as forgeries, that written by the former U.S. ambassador to Oman and also the former U.S. National Security Advisor under the Carter government, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Those 2 letters claimed that the ecumenical patriarch had been an actor in the coup attempt against Erdogan, and the very ugly language was used, calling the patriarch a stooge of the American CIA, a puppet of the Fethullah Gulen movement, and Fethullah Gulen, the former, cooperator with, but now, bête noire of Erdogan, Islamic cleric who is in Pennsylvania. He sought political and religious asylum in the U.S. So claiming that the ecumenical patriarch had worked with both the Gulenists and the U.S. CIA to help perpetrate this coup. Now, those appeared in Russian language sites. They then appeared in pro-Erdogan state media sites in Turkey. So they were translated from Russian into Turkish. And here's where timing is also important. They came out in late August, early September of 2016, and then they appeared in the Turkish media sites on the eve of the September events, the pogrom in 1955. And as they were rewritten in the Turkish sites, they said, we know where those coup plotters are. They are in churches, and go into those churches and seize these coup plotters. So it was an incitement to violence targeting the ecumenical patriarchate. Now, the connection with the Moscow Patriarchate, it's no secret that the Moscow Patriarchate has openly and actively challenged the primacy of honor and authority of the ecumenical patriarch in global orthodoxy. The Moscow Patriarchate boycotted the summer 2016 Holy and Great Council held in Crete. They have denounced the council as neither holy nor great. They have used cyber space to attack the ecumenical patriarch. And given the closeness of the Putin regime with the Moscow Patriarchate figures into the Putin government's, foreign policy of protecting its near abroad and the so-called Ruski Mir Russian world. You see a kind of church-state collaboration in Moscow that is designed to minimize and marginalize the ecumenical patriarch, and you see a state-to-state relationship between two disruptors in terms of the Western alliance, namely Moscow and Turkey. So there's this overlay and this, I would say, marriage of convenience when it comes to the Moscow Patriarchate's religious institutional objectives and the Putin regime's foreign policy and geopolitical objectives. And Turkey is happy to oblige because in this regard, the attacks of the Moscow Patriarchate are helping to, create problems for the already embattled ecumenical patriarchate. And it's sad because this is an intra-Orthodox, feud, and I would say it's a one-sided feud from Moscow, but the consequences are extremely detrimental to the strength and sustainability of the ecumenical patriarchate.
This next question is from Andy Zemenides, and I've brought it up on the screen for our viewers to see it, so it's cutting off our faces a little bit, but we'll take it down once I read it to you. First, thanks for all your amazing advocacy on religious freedom. When it comes to the issue of patriarchal succession, should we be challenging the assumption that Turkish law on who can serve as ecumenical patriarch is inviolate? Patriarch Athenagoras was an obvious exception to this.
I think that's a great question because this is really sort of about, tactical tactics and strategy. I think there's the inside and outside dimension to the question. Inside, and by that I mean the community. For Greek Orthodox Christians, it's very important for us to not become victims of Turkish political propaganda. And that propaganda has been unwavering and consistent, namely that you must be a Turkish citizen. And it's been so successful that for a long period of time, I think many Greek Orthodox thought that was actually the case. And as Andy pointed out, we have empirical evidence, albeit an exception, nonetheless evidence in the person of the former ecumenical patriarch Athenagoras that that's not the case. So I think Orthodox Christians need to be very, very clear that this is a piece of Turkish propaganda that's made its way into the street, and it's also made its way into policy discussions. So that's one piece of it. So that's, again, a violation, a direct violation of religious freedom by the Turkish state interfering in the internal function of the ecumenical patriarchate, and it must be presented as such. Now, then there's the other kind of tactical question as well about, well, what do you do in the face of an oppressive, and I would say rogue state, because that is how Turkey behaves. Both, it has a Stalinesque, authoritarian, almost totalitarian quality to it. Anyone who's visited the new airport in Turkey will see that. I mean, it's one of these Stalinesque colossal structures that's designed to present Turkey as, a world power. So we see a kind of Stalinesque totalitarian style regime emerging in Turkey domestically, and a rogue foreign policy regime coming out of Turkey. But what do you do then in the face of that? Going to Andy's question. And I think in the short term, what has been done is what I think when you have almost no choices, you take the least worst choice. And that least worst choice has been the acceptance of dual citizenship by by hierarchs belonging to the ecumenical patriarchate, everywhere from the United States to Canada to Australia and to other locations in the world, so that they have dual citizenship and, at least according to the Turkish state's technicality, can be considered as patriarch. But I think we need to recognize that as a least worst choice, and one that we should be working towards, to eliminate by offering the full choice, which is freedom to choose. That's part of religious freedom rights for any community. So that's the answer. I think the problem is that there's no maximalist, fully satisfactory answer. There is being handed a bunch of lemons. So the question is, how do you make lemonade in the short term out of those lemons in order to allow for the survival of the institution, while also educating the Greek Orthodox community and policymakers who can have an impact on changing this?
This next question is from Evan Karabelas, and he mentions that 2 days ago, Professor Dimokopoulos, in our very series, identified the U.S. as one of the better advocates on behalf of the ecumenical patriarchate. You've served on the U.S. Committee on International Religious Freedom, and as Evan states, as he recalls, you had to fight hard to get the committee and the State Department to call out Turkey. What is still lacking in terms of the U.S. advocacy of religious freedom in Turkey, and what more can we do? What are the best channels to work through? And I want to combine it with another question that came in just now, and it asks essentially, where is the UN and the rest of the world on this issue of religious freedom? And tying it in, how do we advocate for those forums too to make a difference on this issue?
Sure. I think, in terms of the U.S. government, certainly since 1998, with the formation of all sorts of, agencies, bureaus, offices in the State Department, the National Security Council, and also the Independent Commission, the agency, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, there are a variety of spaces in which one can advocate then on behalf of the patriarchate. So I think it's important to be active in those spaces because, what the State Department Office on International Freedom is doing and what the Independent Commission on International Religious Freedom and what the National Security Council may be doing they're not always on the same page. And so there needs to be a consistency of message in all of those spaces, customized, of course, to the priority of those spaces. An example, so the national security expert on religious freedom needs to understand why religious freedom and security are two sides of the same coin. And, explaining why in the case, for example, of the Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community, and frankly, by extension, all Christian communities and all so-called non-conforming Muslim communities in Turkey, that preserving that religious pluralism is absolutely crucial for sustaining or encouraging rule of law, equality before the state, tolerance, and also for a kind of education that prioritizes respect, tolerance, and equality. So customize, same core message, customize to these different governmental spaces and be unrelenting so that always be part of the conversation. Because we live, as we all know, in a mediatized world, and in 24 seconds, people forget 24 hours, 24 seconds, people forget you. So it's important to always be out there and be part of the conversation. And then and be active as well in the think tank community. That working group on Christians and religious pluralism in the Middle East offers an opportunity to bring together people from, various sectors of, think tank community to learn about what's happening with Christians and also why it's important to sustain religious pluralism in the region. And then finally, with regard to the UN, alas, I would say, although the UN should be, an organization that is very active on the preservation of religious freedom and religious pluralism
and cultural heritage through UNESCO,
cultural heritage protection. I think it's been relatively weak and anodyne in the work that it's done. And one of the main spaces, the Committee on Human Rights, where these kinds of issues are oftentimes discussed. Unfortunately, many of the countries that become members of the Committee on Human Rights in its rotational are some of the worst human rights violators in the world. So that's become a space that has been discredited simply by virtue of the states that are part of it. One thing I would, and I'd be happy to share some of these other resources with you. I would urge people to look at also, cultural heritage institutions like Cultural Heritage Partners. There's a fantastic site called Culture in Crisis by the Victoria and Albert Museum that works with the World Monuments Foundation and the Cultural Heritage Partners, where it's a resource where you can learn a lot about what's happening with cultural heritage preservation and also post projects and seek funding for projects on restoration, preservation, and protection. That's a phenomenal site that is a kind of gatekeeper for a whole host of governmental and non-governmental institutions that include the full panoply, from the museum community, from the art collection community, from the policing community, from the human rights community, that deal with the question of cultural and religious heritage in the ways we've been discussing. So be present in those and be active in those.
I know we've kept you for quite a while in this conversation, so I want to conclude by emphasizing a point that you've made in the past about Turkey's cultural religious heritage policy being one of memoricide, the end of genocide. And I want to give you some time to give us a final comment on that.
So yes, that's a term that I think is important for us to incorporate into our vocabulary. Those of us who are concerned with human rights and cultural and religious heritage, and I've used that term memoricide, and it's part of the scholarly literature. You'll see it in the media as well, and I can share some citations and articles, but I mentioned this issue of intergenerational transmission and living community with, people who are part of the community, but what happens also when those people are gone? And how does the community remember and perpetuate itself? The end phase of genocide is the erasure and the eradication of memory. If there are no people there to represent and pass on who they are, if the structures, the physical structures that give testimony to the fact that they once were, are now either destroyed or repurposed in the ways we've been discussing, the community is literally forgotten. And so its existence is forgotten. And that is one of the, concomitant components of genocide. But in the case of the still falling of the city, I would argue that the effort to erase the memory of what was the Byzantine Empire, who were Eastern Christians, what is the ecumenical patriarchate, means that the Queen of Cities is still falling. And the danger of forgetting, both for the community and the community globally, but also for the rest of the world, is clear and present. And it's clear and present because of Turkey's rogue state behaviors. And it's, as I said, I would say Stalinesque, totalitarian policies domestically.
And that final point, I think, is especially prescient now that towards the end of April, we'll be remembering the Armenian genocide. And in May, again, we'll be remembering the onset of the Pondian genocide. So it's something for all our listeners to keep in mind and to reflect on. Dr. Prodromou, I want to thank you for joining our podcast. Not our podcast, our live series here. A little habit there. But thanks for speaking to our audience, taking their questions. We're excited to work with you and to hopefully have you back on to discuss some of these topics again.
Thank you. Thank you to you, Thano. Thank you to Andy. Thank you to HALC for all the work you're doing. And also congratulations on this week-long series. And I look forward to being part of conversations and activities moving forward. And I wish anyone who's celebrating a blessed Holy Thursday and approaching Pascha, Easter.
And as we end this installment of the series today, I want to remind everybody that we have one more event coming up tomorrow on Old Rome and New Rome in A Tale of Two Cities, which is bound to be very interesting. So make sure to tune in for that. And next week, we're partnering with the Embassy of Greece to do a series on the 2500th anniversary of the battles of Salamis and Thermopylae that changed the course of Western civilization as we know it. So make sure to tune into those. We'll be featuring Paul Cartledge on Monday, Stephen Pressfield, the author of Gates of Fire, on Wednesday, and Professor Barry Strauss on Friday to talk about the Battle of Salamis. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Tune into our future programming, and Kaliana Sasita, everybody.
Thank you.